Welcome to Who Knows Real Estate, Episode 7, Breweries and Restaurants. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Jim. And on today's episode, our guest, Addison.demallie, broker at National Restaurant Properties, does an amazing job breaking down the restaurant and brewery industry and how it affects real estate investors. He goes over trends in the food and drink industry, how to add additional square footage at an amazing price point, how to negotiate leases, and much more. Here it is.
Today we've got a discussion to have with Addison.demallie. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Jim.
And welcome to our episode on retail and restaurant locations. We're welcome to have Addison with us today. DeMallie, as I said. Addison, you mind giving us a little breakdown of your past, present, and future, what you've got going on?
Yeah, sure thing. I grew up here in Charlotte, been in commercial real estate and business brokerage for restaurant and bars for 2 years now. I was working at an institutional investment company for a few years, sitting behind a computer, looking at spreadsheets all day, and got bored and I wanted to kick rocks on the street and got into this. We do traditional commercial real estate brokerage, purchase, sale, lease, represent tenants, and landlords sign leases. And then we also do the business brokerage part, which is similar to like investment banking for small businesses under, 5 to 10 million in revenues.
Okay. Do you want to get into some of the schematics of how, what folks are looking for location wise and the new businesses in general? I guess we can talk about different types of businesses from restaurant to breweries to office locations. Maybe a little bit about locations.
Yeah, sure. So, I think the most important thing right now is walkability and getting the foot traffic. At the end of the day, restaurants, bars, breweries, hotels, even. They're all street corner businesses. So, people are going to be looking for the best spots for their concept, residential density, and then Instagrammable spots too.
Yeah, I can see that being a big growing segment is the Instagramming.
Yeah, what are some things that you've seen successful landlords do, or best practices?
Yeah, from a real estate perspective, I think a lot of landlords forget that they're a business partner of the tenant. And if they don't look at that relationship that way, that they're going to be, handcuffing themselves out of the gate. I would say the next thing would be to use a broker, right?
Yeah.
No sales pitch necessary. But I really think that the most important part of the leasing process is credit evaluation of the tenant, and brokers see that every day. They're out on the streets and they've got an idea of what people can do in certain spots. And then behind that, it would be the attorneys, bankers, accountants, the typical people that any real estate guy would have on his team.
You talk about the partnership between the landlord and the tenant, and that's one of the most important things you're talking about, because a lot of the leases and businesses you're looking at, there's a significant amount of rent that's coming in every month.
Right.
So, the ability to keep that revenue stream going for, in their long-term leases, they're 3 to 5 to 10 year leases with options involved. So what are some of the, can you give us some examples of how you've seen a landlord, really partner up with a tenant to make sure that they do succeed?
Sure. I think the most creative way, you don't see this too often, but the most creative way to do it would be a straight percentage of sales lease. It's pretty common in the hotel business. If you were to lease out, if you were to own a hotel property and lease it to a company, that you would do it on maybe 7%, 7.5% of annual sales would go to the property owner. Beyond that, I think just working with the tenant to provide the things they need for leasehold improvements, upfit money, that kind of stuff. And in our market for restaurant and bar properties, some of the independent spots, a lot of the landlords are former restaurant and bar operators themselves, so they can provide insight to the tenants.
Yeah, almost on a consulting basis.
Exactly.
To some degree.
Exactly.
And that number, I like the percentage of revenue because you can kind of back into that number too as a landlord. Like,
right.
Hey, I mean, I guess you can as much as you can. There's a lot of forecasting that's going to be involved in
sure.
that.
And you've got credit requirements for if you've got debt on the property, they might require you to have a certain coverage ratio, and there might be a minimum, whether it's $2,000 or $3,000 a month minimum rent payment, but then a 7.5% of sales lease. That would be the most creative way. It's honestly not too common, but it does happen.
Yeah. And I don't want to get too granular on it, but we talked a little bit about the upfit costs, which are obviously significant,
right,
especially in some of these businesses, whether it be a restaurant, a brewery, any kind of retail. What's the most common thing? Does the tenant fork that out and then get reimbursed by the landlord, or the landlord pay for that up front, given that it's a quality tenant?
Usually the tenant has to spend it and have it to get it back. That's a credit evaluation tool to make sure you're not giving money to a guy that's not going to show up, to his first day of on the job.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Are there circumstances where they might front it if it's a strong enough tenant?
Yeah, absolutely. And the stronger you are as a tenant, you might get equipment put in by the landlord. You might get a full build out. I've seen it happen too, where, the landlord does the entire build out. They, roll, the money that they put in into the rent at a yield that they need to make it make sense. And they put the key in the operator's hand and say, give me a rent check in 30 days.
Yeah. That's going to work out well.
Yeah. That's brave.
Yeah. And you've got to, you've got to have a good, tenant that, you believe in to do something like that. I would say, where it gets tricky, I would imagine this goes across the board for any industry, but especially for restaurants. When the landlord owns the equipment, it complicates things a little bit. So I would, suggest that they do, anything, based on the terms they negotiate up to, short of putting the equipment in, because usually when the tenant leaves, the lease states that it needs to be returned to the condition that it was when they took it over. And if that's 20 years down the road and, $50,000 worth of restaurant equipment's broken, they need to put $50,000 into the building.
Yeah. Plus the fact that you've got another tenant that you might come in if this lease doesn't go on. And
right. And it could be a totally different concept.
Right.
You could be going from a Brazilian steakhouse to a cocktail bar.
Right. What's the average? There's no average, but what do you see on like a restaurant or something similar what's a typical build out cost?
I'd say about $150 a foot, depending on the concept. There are ways to spend a lot more than that. There's ways to spend a lot less than that. There's people in Charlotte right now putting $1 million build outs into buildings they don't own. And where you can really go sideways is when you're putting money into things that don't generate cash. Your oven, your range that produces something for you to sell, the tiles on your floor don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I went to a newer French restaurant downtown, and I think the lighting package alone in there was probably $500,000.
Right.
Yeah, it was intense.
What do you see as like the normal build out time when doing the tenant improvements?
It depends on the concept again, but yeah, I'd say 3 to 6 months. Like a neighborhood bar that doesn't have a kitchen. Somebody like that could be open in less than 30 days. If they're doing a, huge restaurant and, really nice build out, it could take 6 months. I've seen people come in. A lot of it has to do with, process knowledge too. I've seen people come in from out of state and, try to do the entire build out themselves, because they maybe had a construction background somewhere else, and it ended up taking them 2 years to get open. So I can't emphasize enough that, outsourcing responsibilities to people with local market knowledge is really important.
Yeah, I can see that easily. You come into a new market and you could build 100 of these, but you haven't built them with the local vendors and suppliers.
Exactly. So. Building codes.
Right. Building codes. Yeah, for sure. We kind of already talked about a little bit, like with the revenue with the rental rate based on the gross sales. But how do you see it? I guess I'm guessing it's gone wrong where you've seen, or you can see rental rates negatively impact a business.
Absolutely. I mean, once you start creeping up past 8, I'd say even, for a really good location, 10% could be healthy of, triple net base rent, and then the add-ons on top of that. But once you get above 10% of sales for net rent payments, it really starts eroding the profit margin. And the backbone of the restaurant business for the last, 5,000 years has been cheap labor, cheap rent, and cheap food costs. And we're really in a period of time where the margins are shrinking so much that they're lucky to get 15 cents on every dollar that comes in the door to go in their pocket. So if you think about your rent becomes 15% of sales and you're running a 10% margin, that cuts your profits in half.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you've got your food margin and you've got your booze margin. Well, how does that affect? I don't want to get too far into just restaurants, but how does is there a shift going on where you're seeing more of one versus the other, food versus the booze?
Yeah, I think it depends on the neighborhood. It depends on the neighborhood, depends on the demographics. North Carolina is really interesting in that the way our ABC Commission regulates restaurants, you need 30% food sales to be considered a restaurant, which, knowing the difference between a restaurant and a private club in the state of North Carolina is something important for landlords to know, because it's different client bases and activities that are going to happen. And there's a lot of famous neighborhood bars. Selwyn Pub is a private club.
Yeah, that is definitely a famous spot in town.
It is. Can you talk about what first movers in a neighborhood look for? For example, like a brewery that's the first one to open up in an area.
Right.
What are they looking for to be able to choose what neighborhood to go into?
I think the first thing that people are looking for is cheap rent. Like where is it's a seesaw between cheap rent and rooftops. So like where are the rooftops being built, but the commercial pricing, real estate prices aren't there yet. And it's a very fine line between finding value and, not being robbed at gunpoint sometimes. Yeah. I've had, friends, I grew up with, bought houses in, 10 years ago, right outside Uptown. And, they got killer deals, probably 7 or 8x on their cost basis now. But they were robbed at gunpoint the first year they lived in the house.
Yeah, there's a price you pay for that. Well, you say the smart ones maybe you should say the smart ones are looking at the rent costs because they're looking at their
margins.
Their margins,
right? But
I'm guessing all folks in those businesses don't follow those same rules.
Right. And I think that a lot of people are they just cluster around where other people are.
Yeah, kind of follow the leader kind of deal.
Right.
Which isn't always a great move.
Correct.
Are the first movers sophisticated enough, or do they look at the average wage income of the neighborhood, not just number of people? Because it's easy to find cheap buildings in not so great areas.
Right.
But if there's no one that can buy their $15 burger.
So, I mean, that's important. I think that you've for independent bars and restaurants, it's way more of an art than it is a science. When you get into commodity food, fast food, QSR, that's a lot more important. It is important for independents, but if you have depending on what your concept is, if it's a destination concept, you could be in the worst spot in town and, you're going to do $2 million a year in sales.
Yeah, we talked about this before we got started. That there's, I want to call them almost suburban areas around the town that do better business than the spots right in downtown, in downtown Charlotte,
right. And some of the perimeter towns, and it's weird, on one side, in Charlotte, you've got Ballantyne and Belmont. I think Belmont is the highest disparity between, how high the sales are and how low the rents are. That's going to change the market's going to correct that. But to me, that's a big time buy signal for places like Belmont, and maybe a stay away for Ballantyne.
Yeah, because you've got the complete opposite in Ballantyne, right?
Right.
Even though you've probably got significantly higher average household income.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got to remember and I think that comes back to density. Maybe the neighborhood isn't dense enough for how high the incomes are. And even if you make, $300,000 a year, are you going to spend more than somebody that makes $90,000 a year eating out at restaurants? Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Can you talk about like what the effect Starbucks has on neighborhoods and all of the retail and restaurants that kind of follow them and your targets of the world?
Yeah. And I think that like Starbucks and, some of the bigger, corporate real estate guys, they've got, really good, real estate departments, really good, brokers and folks they team up with to help pick sites. I don't believe that Starbucks makes neighborhoods better. I think they're just really good at picking sites in neighborhoods that are growing
that nobody's identified yet.
Right.
They were there, obviously. Right. They didn't build the neighborhood around it. So
exactly.
They just did more homework or saw something that nobody else could see.
Yeah, they're not in the clubhouse at a new suburb,
right,
on the edge of town.
Right. How do you attract food and beverage tenants as a landlord?
I think it has to do so much with owning properties in the right locations, owning cool properties. Nobody wants to put in a restaurant in an old, 90s dentist office, right?
Yeah.
The cooler your building is, the cooler tenants you're going to find sometimes. Because so much of the back end sales for the restaurant have to do with aesthetics. It's something that you really have to think about more than a convenience store or office space.
Yeah, I mean, you do see sometimes where I guess there's got to be a vision from the restaurant as well, because you'll see old gas stations that somehow seem to make it.
Right.
They've got the vision. Obviously, it's going to be going back to like the Starbucks effect. They're picking the right location for it. So I guess you can beautify anything, but from the start, right out of the gate, if you've got a good looking property, you're going to be miles ahead of someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for identifying like good looking properties other than like some of the more obvious ones, like it actually looks good, but some like unique properties?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's getting tougher to find unique properties because we're going to eventually run out of old buildings, right? But I think it's buildings that were, originally designed for something that are easily convertible, like the auto garages. They've already, they got 3 or 4 garage bays, and people are going in and putting in breweries in them, and garage doors. Building materials is important. If you've got old wood siding on a commercial building that used to be a house that people bootstrapped together over the years, it's not going to be as cool to go have a meal at with your wife and kids as a brick building or concrete. Yeah,
we've mentioned breweries like 3 or 4 times already, so why don't we just jump on that horse and see where we can go. You mentioned before we got started that there was a brewery rage 20, 30 years ago, and let's talk about that. Why that fell apart, and if we're getting there again.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that and I love breweries. I spend a lot of my free time at them, but I think that a lot of them, we were at especially for Charlotte when it was at a point in time when real estate was really cheap in these industrial areas. We were coming out of a really bad financial crisis, and they snagged some really cool old buildings. But I think that the brewery community in general misunderstood the market. The consumer demand was for beer gardens, cool places to go out, drink beer, and you see, a lot of folks in town, even breweries that were successful as beer gardens doubled down and reinvested their profits in production facilities and canning lines and distribution. And they don't have the balance sheet to compete with Anheuser-Busch or Miller Coors on distribution. I mean, that's not a business that I want to be in, competing with, the big guys on, clipping pennies off of beer bottles. I think that, the ones that have been the most successful and the ones that will stay around are the ones who realize that they're bars and they're beer gardens. And that's why I think that a lot of the local breweries have started adding kitchens. It's funny that the guys who I talk to who own breweries, they call me about restaurants and bars now. And the guys that are trying to become, brewers and open a brewery, they don't want anything to do with a restaurant or a bar.
Yeah. So they're not thinking about it right.
Right. There's a difference in, there's a respect for the craft, and the craft of, making a local product is awesome, but there's a difference between art and business.
Yeah. And what about the rents? Like, the rents obviously help folks that got into it 6-7 years ago or whatnot, and were able to keep those rates low.
Exactly.
Or maybe even buy the building and they're locked in, let's just say. Versus folks coming in now trying to compete. They're paying probably 5x, right? What some of these guys were paying?
Yeah.
What do those rates look like?
I mean, so originally you had, coming out of the financial crisis, you had industrial buildings that were, borderline obsolescent in some cases. And, they went in at, $5 a square foot or less in some cases. And, now you've got brewery signing leases at $25 a square foot. I just don't, I mean, when you think about the amount of space, I don't know what the ratio of square feet off the top of my head that the tanks take up in a brewery, but what adds value in a restaurant or bar is seats. How many times you can turn the seats. It's, pretty simple calculations. It's a lot of square feet of retail space to be taken up by a tank.
Which could be located in like less prime real estate.
Exactly.
If you wanted to keep brewing your own beer.
Exactly.
Yeah. What is it, you mentioned earlier on, like this going on in the 90s. Is that the downfall then, you believe, is the rents just got out of hand? And
yeah, I think that, it had to do with the rents, growing up. The business back then was, it was a little different than it is now because it was more brew pub driven, and I think that partly they didn't go big enough back then, and I still think they're not going big enough now. If you want to brew and distribute, it takes millions of dollars to put a full production facility online that's capable of pumping out something like like a smaller national brand like Shinerbach or somebody like that.
Yeah, the brewery. You're seeing an end to it possibly at some point in the near future.
Yeah, and I think that it'll go. Like the 5 years ago it was the burger restaurants, and 5 years before that it was the frozen yogurt places that were in every shopping center maybe in the country.
Cupcakes too.
Yeah, cupcakes, absolutely. But I definitely think there's going to be some consolidation. I think the people that have done real well in the last cycle have done well enough to expand their product line, get into other markets, whether it's coffee. There's breweries in town that are adding coffee and other drinks. Some of them do a good job with kombucha. That's a very high margin product that keeps the lights on.
Yeah, I've read. I'm not in the business like you are, but I'll read on occasion, and it seems like that segment of the market is posed to grow the most in the near future. Is that kombucha or not even non-alcoholic drinks, or even some of the seltzer, like hard seltzers? It looks like that part of the business has huge potential. Right,
and then I think it's important. And that's a distribution focused business. It's not a retail real estate play. So I think there'll be a point of time, even when rents get high enough, even when they own the building, they might become landlords and lease it out to another concept.
What are some of the other trends you see in the food and beverage space You mentioned kombucha. What are some other things you see coming up?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm the most excited about is the ghost kitchens. So, and this is a really cool real estate product. And I think that, most of the trends right now are real estate product driven, kind of reinventing or mixing up how these concepts are delivered to the market. The ghost kitchens is basically taking, really cheap industrial space, the same thing that the breweries were doing, and turning it into a commercial kitchen without a retail presence. So, and then you could, be delivering your food yourself or use Postmates or, one of the big national delivery service, Uber Eats. And it's a way to capitalize on very cheap rent and still hit your sales numbers.
Yeah, that's great because 100% of the space can be used for production.
Exactly.
And then you use Postmates network or a number of them.
You outsource the delivery aspect.
Yeah, the marketing and delivery. There's no sit down, no waiters,
no customer service. It's
as long as the building's centrally located, it could be in a very bad area where there's robbery, so to speak. It doesn't matter. No customers are coming.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. You can be fenced in. No.
That's a great concept.
Yeah.
And if you get a few of those, obviously it'd be great as a landlord to just take advantage of that.
And
space.
It's just like flying on a plane. Airplanes have two engines because if one goes down, you still got one. I mean, you could literally have, and I've been talking to some folks, this is coming, where you have 3, 4, 5, maybe 10, 2,500 square foot restaurant. And it doesn't just have to be a restaurant. It could be, a startup confectionist, a candy maker, baker, clustering the concepts together, would be able to benefit them a lot.
Yeah. And I think you've got another concept is the food hall, right?
Right. That's interesting. I would say that my take on the food hall is a little more pessimistic than ghost kitchens.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a really cool real estate product. It looks cool. The landlords are making a bunch of money. The sales pitch is that it's an incubator for restaurant concepts, but in every other market where they've been put in, the operators just aren't making money. There's not enough foot traffic. It's too many places in one spot. Sometimes they can't serve alcohol, depending on, sometimes the landlord serves alcohol. And that's 30% or more of the average restaurant's sales.
Yeah. I've been lucky to see a few of them, but I can't really comment because I saw them in huge destinations like Madrid. I was there last summer. A really cool one there. Right. I loved it though.
It's a great experience. It's a great experience for the consumer. And, that's why, so much hype has been, and they look really cool. And that's why so much hype has been created around them. But from a tenant perspective, they're just not making the money that, they need to be making to keep it going long term. And eventually that'll trickle back to the landlords.
Yeah. Not again, as a novice in the restaurant game, you always hear landlords or even tenants talk about the costly upfits of the property or you get into the ventilation and whatnot. Right. I thought the cool thing about these food halls is you can have one gigantic fan in there and you've got 20 restaurants in there, right? Right.
No, and that's good and it could be bad. To me, it's taking the it's taking the model from office space where you might have the utilities, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, but your concept might not need to be open as much as another person's concept, but while they're using AC, you're paying for AC.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So it's not necessarily and there's different ways to structure it, separately metering the gas and the electric. I'm sure they do that, but it's taken the traditional triple net format away from restaurants.
Going back to the ghost kitchens, if an investor was interested in buying some industrial space, how would they go about attracting a like ghost kitchen concept to come in, bring their equipment,
right,
and start running their business, like what would you recommend for them?
So I think the best, they definitely need to talk to people in other markets. It might not be as easy as Charlotte. Charlotte has a huge deficit in commercial kitchen space.
Yeah,
I'm sure if somebody up in one of these up here, they could have it leased out in a couple of weeks. But
can you promise that?
No promises. Offer not valid in the state of North Carolina. The big thing with that, with the ghost kitchens, is that there's different ways to do it. We talked about Boxman earlier. You could lay a concrete pad, have the tenant bring in their own kitchen in a shipping container, which is what Boxman Studios is doing in Charlotte. They're building kitchens and shipping containers. That's the leanest way to do it. The other way is to either build a building or take over an existing industrial building. And I think there's a huge cost advantage for the landlord doing 5 to 10 of these at once, separately, getting them separately metered, separate gas lines,
to each spot.
To each spot.
Because we're talking now about more open air design, where you could do, like, if you're talking about food trucks or a container, whatever it is, it'd be in an outdoor environment.
Right. And that, I think, for the food truck or shipping container design, it would be more of a outdoor environment for a retail use. The ghost kitchen would be more of an industrial use.
Yeah. Right. Would you see that? How close to other walkability could it be a destination, you think? I
think it could. I mean, from depending on where the land's at price wise, and what idea somebody had, it could be anything from a massive drive-through, like 6 drive-throughs, to something totally off the beaten path that retail customers don't come to at all, and as a shipping container or an industrial building on a side of town with the cheapest rent.
Yeah. To some degree, you got to be a bit of a pioneer to take a chance. And
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You're definitely rolling the dice.
It would definitely be a dice roll. And pioneers, sometimes end up with arrows in their back, right?
Yeah.
But, I think it's, one of the more interesting restaurant, real estate products we've heard about lately. We first got the idea, but somebody called us about a year ago, and they wanted to do a delivery only steakhouse. So you could order steak, all the fixings, baked potato, whatever, and they would have it in an industrial area right off, the west side of town, or 277, where they could get around. It's the site selection would run along the lines of like a logistics company. Yeah, because it would be a delivery-driven business, and where they could get the cheapest real estate and in the drive time and radius of the best neighborhoods in town for whatever concept they're designing.
And to keep that steak warm.
Yeah, right. The steak has got to be warm when it gets there. That
could be a huge downfall.
Got to be sizzling.
You send me out a cold steak, we're gonna have words about it. Like, there's gonna be a problem.
Right.
People might get hurt. Can we talk about negotiating leases? We've talked a lot about where you want to be ideally, or not paying too much, and what you can expect to pay. Go through the negotiating part of the leases.
Yeah, I mean, and especially on the independent side for restaurants and bars. Outside, there's not a ton of negotiation around things, outside of, price and terms, key terms. The most important part of the lease that a lot of tenants don't think about is the assignment clause. And that's the part of the lease, depending on how it's worded, allows you to transfer the lease to somebody else. A lot of the value in restaurants, right now, most of the retail leases are fixed. And, if you sign an under market lease, 7-8 years down the road, there's a lot of equity created in your business. And if that's transferable, you can capture that. If it's not, you can't.
So as a landlord, we don't want it to be assignable.
I don't know if they wouldn't want it to be assignable. I don't know if you would want someone in your building that didn't have an out if they needed it, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so if the restaurant's going out of business and the restaurant doesn't have the ability to go out and market their space, that is what it is. Some landlords compromise by putting in a fee
assignment fee,
an assignment fee or a business sale fee, where they get not a profit share, but if the business is sold, they get a price off of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, if the landlord isn't taking risk, they should be, expecting to just get the fixed rent payment every month, and agree to what they agreed to.
Yeah, I'm sure I don't understand this as much as I should, but yeah, it seems silly to risk having no rent versus, continued rental.
Exactly.
income.
And, the landlord, I view landlords the position very similar to the position of a bank. They go out and they make a fixed loan and they put the risk on the tenant, to operate. And, 7 years down the road, if they're in a 10-year lease, if the market rent is $5 a square foot more than their 3% annual increases or what they projected, they left money on the table. But, do you want to leave money on the table or do you want to sleep at night?
Yeah. Can you talk about like negotiating the tenant improvements of who pays for how much or what?
So I think that it's more of a function of how good the credit market is. Similar like with seller financing, when the banks aren't lending money, seller financing's more popular. Right now there's probably not too many seller financing deals going on with real estate. The SBA loan program is amazing for restaurants and bars, nightclubs. They're the breweries. The restaurants are the number one industry that SBA loans were originated in, which you wouldn't expect. And everybody, always throws out the, stats about how risky restaurants are. From a landlord perspective, it's really important to know that the SBA default loan rate on a restaurant's only 19%.
Wow.
And that happens on average after the 4th year in operation. So it's way less risky than it's perceived by the marketplace. That being said, if somebody can go out and put, $200,000 down with a bank and get $1 million SBA loan to build out a restaurant, they don't need the landlord to put up any tenant improvement money. And, the market's so tight right now anyways from the supply side that the landlords don't really have to. But it comes back to, who do you want to be in your building? Do you the best operators, if you want the best operator in the building, you need to make the best deal.
Yeah.
What's like a normal range of returns that you see landlords looking for on their tenant improvement money that they put in?
I think it's varied. Maybe, from my perspective, it should match the cap rate of the property. So somewhere in the 5 to 10% range.
Can you talk a little bit about like what the difference is between working with national brands versus like independent ones?
Right. So the national brands are, way more capitalized, way easier to work with, at the end, but it takes a really long time to get to that point. They will, the national franchise QSR folks, they might negotiate a site for a year or more. An independent restaurant, depending on whether it's on market or off market, right? If it's on the market, they'll go quicker, but they do a lot of off market work too. And then I'd say with an independent, I've walked into a place and somebody said, I want to buy this. Like, do you have an offer with you? Just on the spot. So, but the opposite of that is that they're less capitalized and less experienced. So there's sometimes more headaches, but if you manage the process, especially for landlords, if you're doing the credit checks, getting financial statements, making sure that they've got the money and the resume to pull off the deal, then you're just fine.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on these podcasts, is evaluating the tenants.
Yeah.
And any advice you can give to folks on things that they typically don't look for?
That a landlord doesn't look for that they should?
Yeah.
I think that the landlord needs to understand. I think the biggest disconnect with, landlords and, in this regard is landlords don't understand what kind of sales a restaurant can do at that site. So the landlord needs to understand, or they need to have a broker or a consultant or, somebody that helps them understand, because that's the basis of what the rent should be. People just look at buildings, and what other places are leasing for on the market. If it's not a restaurant, is it really comparable? And is it a restaurant? How do you know that's appropriate? Like we talked about Belmont, places are doing $2.5 million in sales with $18 a square foot rent. That's probably half of where it could be on a worst case and still hit the benchmarks.
Yeah. Yeah, they could sell half of that and still have a great business.
So the landlords need to understand how much cash these retail businesses can generate on their side.
How can like an investor figure out where those trends are and where those opportunities are, who's like maybe not in the restaurant space right now in Belmont? How do we find out that Belmont's the place to be for restaurants?
So, and I mean, it's tougher because when you're dealing with small business, it's private markets, private data. It's really tough to figure out the numbers, but it goes back to putting your boots on the ground and going and kicking the rocks in small towns and kicking the rocks in different neighborhoods and talking to people. That's another thing that, just if I'm listing a building, the first thing I do is go and talk to every neighboring business and ask what they wish they had in their neighborhood for lunch. Or, talk to people on the street and ask, what kind of dinner spots that they go to that they've got to drive a long way to get to. It's, being on the street and, being out with the public and talking to folks. That's the only way you can get it without, being really good friends with somebody's accountant.
So it sounds like what you need is almost a broker who specializes in the food beverage space. Do you have any advice for people who are looking to meet an Addison in their town or in their city? How do they find that person that is that local expert, that is the boots on the ground? Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of, we're talking about the real estate trade organizations. ULI is probably one of the best. ICSC, International Council of Shopping Centers. They're a really good, ICSC is probably the premier retail organization. And then also, if you want to own, these types of properties and attract these types of tenants, you can also go to the trade associations for those industries. North Carolina Hotels and Lodging Association, different groups like that. Weirdly, the library here in Charlotte puts on a monthly or quarterly really cool food and beverage program where they have a speaker come in. I think Dalton from Sabor was there one time. They had a brewery panel, and being active in the organizations for the industry that your tenant's in.
That's great.
What about can we talk about, not specifically obviously, but in the restaurant world, you've always got a lot of openings. You've always got a lot of closings going on.
Right.
Can you talk about maybe some trends that you're seeing in that arena?
Yeah. So like we were talking about, the data's private. With hotels, you've got the star reports. You can look at what the ADR is, the average daily rate. You can look at what the occupancy of a market is, and you can kind of model where you think you are. That doesn't exist for restaurants, anything comparative to that. So you've got to, really just get out there and talk to people and, have your boots on the ground.
Well, I don't want to wrap it up too soon, but we usually do a little fire round. Jim, you got a couple questions for him? How about books? You got any journals or books that you can recommend for folks to keep up in the...
Yeah, so I've got a lot of books. Negotiating Commercial Real Estate Leases on Amazon is a really good one. It's more of a law book, but it's if you want to understand the different parts of a lease and what goes into it. That's good. All the ULI books on development have pro formas, and how much, if you're going to develop a building, you need to know what percentage of the cost you can pay for the land, that kind of stuff. And then I'll throw out for the restaurant community, Restaurant Success by the Numbers is a really cool book on concept design, operations. And I mean, it's a pretty good primer on the restaurant business for landlords of restaurant properties too.
Yeah. Now that like upfit, I'm sure you've seen this go horribly wrong. Like folks using the wrong, like thinking they know, some other segment of building or construction, and then coming into restaurant and thinking or just moving to another area. Right. Where do you think things go wrong and right in that scenario?
Yeah. So the it's kind of like when you were 19 and you took economics 101 and you thought you were smarter than the chairman of the Fed. But the where people really get into trouble is when they have a construction background, and there's a lot of construction guys that get in the restaurant business, and sometimes it goes really well, and sometimes it doesn't. And if somebody's from out of the market or a different spot of the country, and they come into town and they don't know the local building codes, the local health codes. So the health codes is even beyond the building code. The health department has certain requirements about how many sinks you need, what the slope of your grease trap needs to be, all the MEP infrastructure that supports the use of a restaurant is super niche. So that's stuff you need to look into. Have a good contractor, local contractor look into for you.
Yeah, you need to, I mean, you're just talking about some internal things inside the building. You get into the external things, and that can vary from one side of the street to the other, depending on how many parking spaces you might need. Right. So, yeah, I can see that. And
Charlotte's really tough on, I think we're one of the strictest in the market for parking spaces required, which, and we get, the government wants us to ride the light rail, but then they also make us have 50 parking spaces for every restaurant that we open, or, it's kind of silly to me, but zoning is huge, and what your setback is, what you can fit on the site, how big the floor area ratio can be.
Yeah, that floor area ratio, somebody like you that's an expert, that's where you guys just pay for yourself, and that alone is, those numbers are workable too. You can move your kitchen around, or like a waiting room or a bar area to get to almost back into if you've only got a set number of parking spaces, you can almost back into that number, can't you, by designing your restaurant the correct way?
The programming, where things are laid out, and will help you, kind of find the best solution there. And also, we're talking about before, using outdoor space. It's really, really important, because you can generate a lot of money outside on a sunny day, but you're not paying rent on the grass in the air.
Yeah, that's a nugget that we haven't even chatted about. We chatted about that before, like the rooftop. You buy a building or you rent a whole building, and there's no rooftop there, but you put one in. Essentially, you just added square footage that you didn't originally pay for.
Right.
And that sometimes can be the most highest income producing area, right?
Right, absolutely. And I'll give you an example where I've got a listing right now that they've already done the plans and gotten it engineered. They just haven't put the rooftop on yet. And basically the cost is $150,000 to add on to the roof a rooftop that would fit 50 seats.
Wow.
And that seems like a no-brainer to me. $3,000 a seat. Make that up, pretty quick.
Yeah.
What's a common mistake or obstacle that landlords don't see before they deal with their first food beverage tenant?
I think it goes back to evaluating the credit of the tenant. I can't stress that enough, how important that is, because there's a lot of bootstrappers in the restaurant business, and everybody wants to help out a bootstrapper, but knowing what they're capable of, and knowing that they've got the cash not only to do the build out, but to keep paying rent through the build out, because usually they only get 2 or 3 months. Sometimes the build out might take 5 or 6. So they're cutting checks on a space that's not making money. So looking at the working capital, how much working capital they have beyond, what the project cost is supposed to do. And then also conceptually, maybe If you own a restaurant in a certain part of town, or a certain area, a certain concept might not work in that spot. So
yeah. So it sounds like not only being careful to evaluate, how much capital they have, but also being realistic to when they're going to open, whether it's 60 days or 90 days or 6 months.
Right. Exactly.
So a realistic approach from both sides. And what about, we talked about somebody going over, like not getting it done in time, not opening in time.
Right.
How often do they go over budget as well?
I don't know. I don't know if I've met somebody that had an on budget build out. I would say almost every time it goes over budget, the more infrastructure you have, the greater the chance. And I mean, there's other ways to control that by doing, fixed price contracts, really having an attorney that knows something about construction contracts and how, to provide assistance in negotiating with your contractor, having a contractor you can trust. But I mean, I've seen people go double over budget. And at that point, once you get double over budget, you're cutting so many corners on the fine touches that, you're handcuffed out of the gate and you're just, probably prolonging the inevitable of closing the doors.
Can you give us an example of something like that happening?
I don't know that I want to.
No names involved.
Yeah, no names.
No names.
Yeah.
But I would say that there was a restaurant uptown that that opened in a hotel, and I think they were open for like 30 days. It was like a Japanese restaurant. They were open for a couple weeks or a couple months, and I would suspect that they spent too much money on the build out and burned up their working capital and closed the door.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. There's folks who are going to want to, get in touch with you, I'm assuming, and get some expertise and hopefully, bring some business your way. Can you tell folks how they can get in touch with you?
Sure. At Addison.demallie, National Restaurant Properties. You can look us up. Our website's restaurantstore.com. We're doing a new website that's supposed to go live, I think, this week. My boss is the guy that owns our company. He's 75. He's owned 26 bars and restaurants in Charlotte himself over the years, and he started selling a few for himself. And that's when he realized, like, I could sell restaurants for other people and make a lot of money.
Quit opening my own.
I'm going to quit opening restaurants and start selling. So, and then that eventually got him into real estate, and he's been doing this in Charlotte for 51 years. He doesn't do too many deals anymore, but still comes in the office every day and yells at me when I'm getting sideways on stuff. But good resource to have. We got our new website's going live this week. The first day I started, I asked him about, I was like, Bob, our website's kind of old. He asked me he was like, you're from the finance industry. What's a change we could make around here? And I talked to him about the website, and he was like, our website looks old. Why don't you go knock on some doors? But so they can look us up on our soon to be new website, restaurantstore.com. Shoot me an email at addison@restaurantstore.com or addison.demallie@gmail.com.
Cool. Got it. This has been a lot of fun. I've had a smile on my face the whole time. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Who Knows Real Estate. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and check out our show notes for the guest contact info as well as ours. Be sure to look for our next episode. Thanks.